They strutted around our neighborhood like self-appointed cops, clipboards in hand, barking orders, and handing out fines. The so-called HOA enforcement officers thought they were untouchable. But arrogance has a way of catching up with people. What began as petty harassment, threats over lawn length, paint shades, and parking, spiraled into outright corruption. They targeted me, my neighbors, and anyone who dared push back. What they didn't know was that their reckoning was coming, and the entire neighborhood would witness their downfall. The quiet street that wasn't so quiet. Our neighborhood looked like something out of a real estate brochure: tree-lined sidewalks, neatly trimmed hedges, a little playground in the cul-de-sac, and two-story brick homes that all looked eerily similar. On the surface, it screamed perfect suburban living. But under the surface, it was run like a dictatorship. The HOA wasn't just strict, it was predatory. And the worst of it came from the so-called HOA enforcement squad, a group of 3 board members who acted like street cops, walking door to door, measuring grass with rulers, taking pictures of cars, and fining families for the smallest violations. Their leader was a man named Richard Holcomb, slick hair, mirrored sunglasses, always holding a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. His 2 shadows, Marcy and Bill, followed him like lapdogs. The 3 of them terrorized the neighborhood under the excuse of protecting property values. But to those of us who lived there, it felt more like extortion. How it started: a target on my back at first. I thought I could ignore them. My house was clean, my yard was fine, and I followed the rules. But apparently, Richard needed to make an example out of someone. That someone was me. The first fine came in the mail: $75 for leaving my trash cans out too long after pickup. The second fine? $150 for having a garden hose visible in my backyard. Then came the real insult: $500 for unapproved paint trim color. My house has been painted the same cream color since I bought it 5 years earlier. They were inventing violations out of thin air. I went to the next HOA meeting to contest it. That's when I realized the game was rigged. The HOA courtroom, the meeting looked like something out of a bad courtroom drama. Richard sat at the head of the long oak table with Marcy and Bill at his side, flipping through papers as if they were judges. When I explained my case, Richard leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Rules are rules. If we let one person slide, the neighborhood falls apart." The other residents who tried to speak up were silenced quickly. One woman mentioned she'd been fined for her kid's bicycle being left outside, and Richard shut her down: "Take responsibility for your home or move out." It became clear, this wasn't about rules. It was about power. And money. The rumors began that night. After the meeting, a group of neighbors gathered in my driveway. We whispered like conspirators. "Did you hear about the invoices?" one man said. "What invoices?" I asked. Apparently, Richard had been inflating repair costs and charging the HOA budget for jobs that were never completed. Landscaping bills, contractor fees, even security patrols. Thousands of dollars were disappearing every year, and no one knew where it was going. Another neighbor, Linda, swore she'd seen Richard and Bill taking envelopes of cash from a local paving company. "Kickbacks," she said. It all made sense. The fines weren't about compliance, they were about feeding Richard's pockets. My breaking point, the tipping point, came when I found a neon orange sticker slapped across my mailbox: "Final notice." Non-compliant home. Legal action pending. They were threatening to sue me over paint colors and trash cans. I stood in my driveway holding that notice while Richard smirked from across the street, clipboard in hand, as if daring me to fight back. That's when I decided I wouldn't just fight back. I'd expose them. Digging into their corruption, I started small. Every fine they issued, I photographed. Every notice, I saved. I kept copies of their inspection letters and even followed them around the neighborhood with my phone camera, recording the ridiculous things they wrote down, like measuring a neighbor's grass and accusing an elderly man of illegal lawn clutter because of his birdbath. Then I went deeper. I requested HOA financial statements, which by law, they had to provide. Richard stalled, but when I threatened legal action, he finally handed them over. That's when the fraud became undeniable. Dozens of charges to maintenance companies that didn't exist. Inflated bills for landscaping jobs that had never been done. Security patrols paid to the tune of $30,000 in a single year, but no one had ever seen a security officer in our neighborhood. The HOA budget wasn't just mismanaged, it was being siphoned like a personal bank account. Rallying the neighbors, I couldn't take Richard down alone. So I started organizing. At first, it was casual, neighbors meeting in living rooms, sharing stories of bogus fines, and comparing invoices. Then it became bigger. We pooled money to hire a lawyer and a private investigator. The PI followed Richard for 2 weeks. What he found was gold: Richard and Bill meeting a contractor in a diner parking lot, accepting envelopes of cash. Marcy funneled HOA funds into her personal account. We had pictures. We had bank records. We had proof. The neighborhood was buzzing. For the first time, people weren't afraid of Richard's clipboard. They wanted justice. Setting the trap, we knew we couldn't just confront them, they'd deny everything. We needed something undeniable. That's when Linda suggested, let's invite the police to the next HOA meeting. Our lawyer drafted a formal complaint. We handed over the evidence to the local authorities, who promised to investigate. But I'll never forget the detective's words: get them to incriminate themselves in front of us. Make it public. So that's what we did. We set the stage for the most unforgettable HOA meeting our neighborhood had ever seen. The night of the meeting, the room was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, standing against the walls, arms crossed, eyes locked on Richard and his cronies. Richard, as usual, opened the meeting with his smug tone. We're here to address the growing problem of noncompliance. But before he could finish, our lawyer stood up. He cleared his throat and said, actually, we're here to address financial misconduct by the HOA board. You could hear a pin drop. Richard froze. Marcy shifted nervously in her chair. Bill laughed it off. Baseless accusations, he said. But then our lawyer began laying out the evidence: photos, invoices, bank statements, projected onto a screen for everyone to see. The neighbors erupted. Shouts of "thieves," and "we want our money back," filled the room. And just as Richard stood to shut it down, the doors opened. 2 uniformed police officers walked in. The entire neighborhood turned to watch as the officers stepped forward, badges gleaming. Richard's face went pale. Marcy whispered something frantically to Bill. The officers spoke clearly: Richard Holcomb, Marcy Kendall, and William Tate, You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of HOA funds." Gasps filled the room. The so-called enforcers who had tormented us for years were about to be dragged out in handcuffs. And the best part? Every neighbor was there to witness it. The next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive. News traveled fast in our community, and word of last night's confrontation had already spread to nearly every household. By the time I stepped out to fetch the newspaper, 3 neighbors had already stopped me to ask if it was true that the HOA's so-called enforcement officer had been caught trespassing and threatening me. I didn't want to spill everything just yet, but I nodded. "It's true," I said carefully, "but this is just the beginning." Because it was. The meeting that changed everything. The HOA president, Mr. Langley, clearly thought he could brush this incident aside. He sent out a formal email later that morning, calling for an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. His tone was dismissive, claiming the entire situation had been misunderstood. He even referred to me by name, implying that I was exaggerating. That was a mistake. By 6 o'clock that evening, the clubhouse was packed with residents. People who normally never attended meetings had shown up, curiosity written all over their faces. The air buzzed with tension. Langley stood at the podium with his usual smugness. To his right sat his enforcer, the very same man who had tried to intimidate me the night before. He was still wearing his HOA-issued polo shirt, looking like nothing had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langley began, "it's come to our attention that certain members of this community have made outrageous claims about our enforcement officer. Let me be clear, these claims are baseless, and the board stands behind our volunteers who keep this neighborhood safe and orderly." I could feel my blood boil. But I stayed calm. I had come prepared. When Langley opened the floor for comments, my hand shot up. "I have something to say." All eyes turned to me. Slowly, I walked to the front of the room. I placed a small USB drive on the podium and looked Langley dead in the eyes. "Before anyone makes up their mind," I said, "I think you should all see this." I handed the drive to the HOA secretary, who reluctantly plugged it into the projector. Within seconds, the screen flickered to life, showing the video footage from my security camera. The moment of truth. The entire room gasped as they watched the HOA enforcer trespass into my yard, shaking his finger at my front door and muttering threats. Then came the part where he tried to tamper with my gate and shouted that he would make an example out of me. By the time the video ended, the room had erupted into whispers. Neighbors exchanged wide-eyed looks. A few even glared at Langley. "This," I said firmly, "is what your so-called enforcement officer does behind closed doors. And it wasn't the first time. He's harassed others, too. People have just been too scared to speak up." One by one, neighbors began to stand. "I saw him threaten Mrs. Carter last week," someone shouted. "He fined me for a cracked flower pot," another neighbor said angrily. "He came onto my porch without permission." The tide was turning. Langley's face turned red as he tried to regain control. This is all taken out of context," he sputtered. But before he could finish, the doors of the clubhouse swung open. The sheriff arrives. To everyone's shock, the county sheriff and 2 deputies walked in. The room fell silent instantly. I had called them earlier in the day and provided the footage. After reviewing it, they decided to show up. The sheriff, a no-nonsense man with years of authority etched into his voice, stepped forward. "Which one of you is Robert Haskins?" he asked, referring to the enforcer by his full name. The enforcer shifted uncomfortably in his seat but raised his hand. "That's me." "You're under arrest for trespassing, harassment, and intimidation," the sheriff said calmly, pulling out handcuffs. The room erupted into stunned silence, then scattered murmurs. "You can't do this," Langley shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a private HOA business." The sheriff turned to him with a cold glare. "No, sir. This is criminal behavior. And the law doesn't bend for HOAs." The deputies moved forward, cuffing Haskins right there in front of the entire neighborhood. The sight was almost surreal. This man who had strutted around with unchecked power was suddenly reduced to a criminal, being marched out of the room while neighbors stared in disbelief. Some people clapped. Others just stood frozen. But everyone knew, the illusion of the HOA's power had been shattered. With their enforcer gone, Langley tried desperately to salvage his image. He rambled about misunderstandings, about the importance of rules, but no one was listening anymore. The residents had seen the truth with their own eyes. That night, a group of us organized. We decided it was time to remove Langley and his board once and for all. Petitions were signed. Meetings were planned, real ones, not the staged kind the board usually ran. The neighborhood had found its voice. And this time, I wasn't standing alone. Within weeks, Langley was voted out. A new board was elected, one that actually listened to the community. Rules were still in place, but they were reasonable, fair, and enforced with transparency. As for me, I didn't want a seat on the board. My goal had never been power, it was simply justice. But I was proud to see neighbors smiling again, kids playing freely in their yards without fear of being fined, and the toxic shadow of corruption finally lifted. Final reflection: sometimes, it takes one person standing up to bullies to inspire an entire community to do the same. The HOA had thrived on fear and silence, but once the truth came out, their house of cards collapsed. And as I watched the enforcer being arrested in front of everyone, I realized something important: justice isn't just about punishment. It's about showing people they don't have to be afraid anymore. That day, our neighborhood took back its freedom, and it all started with one camera, one act of courage, and the refusal to let corruption win. If you enjoyed watching this story of justice and karma unfold, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful HOA revenge stories just like this one. Every week, we share gripping tales where the tables finally turn on those who abuse their power. Hit that subscribe button, stay tuned, and never miss the next twist-filled story of neighbors fighting back and winning.